Warriors Don't Cry, Chapter 1, Part 2. My brother Conrad's bedroom was filled with strange trucks, glass jars of crawly bugs, and a wooden train Daddy made for him. Conrad spent lots of time counting marbles, putting puzzles together, and playing Monopoly. His room always seemed to be cluttered with pieces and parts of things, and Daddy would often march into Conrad's room and demand that he put all his toys and trucks back into the red wooden box they had built together. Daddy worked for the Missouri Pacific Railroad as a hostler's helper. He would arrive home, his huge, muscular body obviously tired from the physical labor of his job. Mother constantly reminded him that if he'd finished just one more course, he could graduate from college and have a professional job that paid more. But he resisted, saying he preferred to work outside in the fresh air where he was free. He loved hunting and fishing and getting away to the wilds where nobody could bother him. It made Mother very angry that he wouldn't follow her advice. I worried that they might do what my friend Carolyn's parents did, get a divorce. At the time, I didn't know the meaning of that word, but I knew that when it happened, her daddy was gone forever. The dining room, with its big oval table, was the place we gathered each night for dinner and evening games. Daddy sat at the brown leather chair, reading his newspaper and working his crossword puzzles. Mother entertained us with reading or checkers and chess, so we wouldn't bother Mother as she studied for her night school exams. She was determined to complete her master's degree. When she began graduate school, our people couldn't attend classes with whites at the University of Arkansas. After much grumbling and dickering, white folks had begun to allow small departments to integrate class by class. She would tell us the story of the lone black man who was trying to integrate the law school. In the classroom, he was forced to sit confined by a white picket fence erected around his desk and chair. When he needed to come or go, he sometimes stumbled over that fence. White people around him sometimes stumbled over that fence too, and still each day when he arrived, there it was encircling him, keeping him separate but equal. Mother began meeting with a few others from our community who were also determined to be admitted to the Graduate School of Education at the university. At the time, they were attending extension classes, but in a separate space set aside for our people. Sometimes we got telephone calls from people warning us not to push any further to integrate the university. Nevertheless, Mother Lois continued her meetings and her classes. I will always remember the night she casually looked up from her papers to tell us she would be one of the first of our people to attend the University of Arkansas. There was a nervous quiver in her voice. The glance she exchanged with Grandma made me realize that they were both frightened of what lay ahead. I can't turn back now, Mother said. Forward is the only way our people can march. Later that winter, she smiled as she talked across the dinner table about the integrated classes. Some nights she would come home exhausted, her face pale and drawn, her teary eyes reflecting the discomfort of her plight. When I asked what happened, she would only say white folks were stubborn about seeing our people as God's ideas. Nevertheless, she survived. A few years later, in 1954, she tugged me forward by my hand as Conrad and Grandma walked just behind us up the sidewalk to her graduation. It was a rare occasion for I saw a few white folks look at Mother with a pleasant expression. This time she didn't seem as nervous around them, maybe because she was wearing the same black cap and gown that they were as she held up the diploma in her hand. It's the first graduate degree I know of in this family, Grandma India said, stroking the document as though it were the same precious tablet given Moses in the Bible. Within our community, we were considered middle-class folk. The middle-class label was mostly because of Mother's teaching job. It didn't mean we had lots of money or lived without struggling to pay our mortgage or the bills. Preachers, teachers, and doctors were usually the only professionals in our community, and hence they were accorded a special kind of respect because they had educational degrees. Certainly, we were not considered radical integrationists or people who made waves. We were quiet, church-going folks. Daddy's Uncle Benjamin Patillo was a preacher who traveled from city to city conducting revivals. I remember spending many a night sitting and fanning myself in churches as he preached while aunts and cousins joined in the choir. We lived in the heart of my community, a short distance from the church and school I attended. As I grew older, I began going places on my own, like to ballet or piano lessons and to Girl Scout meetings. Still, my immediate neighborhood and its people continued to be the most important threads of the tapestry that was my life. With the passage of time, I became increasingly aware of how all the adults around me behaved the same. They were living with constant fear and apprehension. It felt as though we always had a white foot pressing against the back of our necks. I was feeling more and more vulnerable as I watched them continually struggle to solve the mystery of what white folks expected of them. They behaved as though it were an awful sin to overlook even one of those unspoken rules and step out of their place, to cross some invisible line. And yet lots of discussion in my household were about how to cross that line, when to cross that line, and who could cross that invisible line without getting hurt. On those rare occasions when a white person came to our house, children and adults alike would all stand at attention, staring, waiting for them to give orders. There was the milkman, blond and smiling, who leered at Mother Lois every time he delivered our milk. Usually he would insist that she bring him a drink of water, even when she pleaded she didn't have time. He'd set down on his metal case with his glass bottles of undelivered milk and wink at her as he gulped his water. She would clasp her shaking hands, nervously waiting for him to finish and go away. Finally, he would hand the bottle of milk to her. But when she tried to take it from him, he wouldn't let it go and kept holding it tight, forcing her to plead for it. And that's when he would offer her free milk and ice cream if she cooperated with him. Mother Lois's face would turn red, and her mouth would tighten just the same way it did when the insurance man offered her free premiums if she'd be his special colored lady. As always, when either of these men behaved inappropriately, she would urge me to go inside, but somehow I knew I had to disobey. I had to stay with her. Even though they were all adults, the milkman seemed to have some strange power over her, just as the insurance man and other white people did. I watched as she struggled to stay calm while the milkman hassled her. Sometimes my father stood silent in the next room, peeking through a crack in the door and listening to those men insult Mother. He would clench his fist and clear his throat loud, but he wouldn't show his face or say anything. Afterwards, he would either storm out, mumbling under his breath, or sit down in the chair at the dining room table and bury his face in his hands. Sometimes he talked loud as though he really were going to do something awful, but only after the white men left our house. I could tell he really loved Mother and wanted to protect her, but there was an awful big fear keeping him silent. I would sit beside him as he took his shotgun out, oiled and cleaned it. There was a sad, pained look in his eyes as he turned to me and say, "You understand, don't you? That man's got no call to talk to your mama that way." He stood, then paced as he wrung his hands and whispered, "God, give me strength and patience to do your will." He would stroke my cheek and smile as he continued to answer as though he could hear all the questions in my head. "Some day things will be different. Some day our men will be respected and not be called boy and treated like children." Then he would calm down and smile, describing his visits to states like North Dakota and Pennsylvania, where our men were treated as equals, where they looked white men in the eye fearlessly, where they could protect their women. These were places where we would all move some day. There were so many times when I felt shame and all the hope drained from my soul as I watched the adults in my family kowtow to white people. Whenever we shopped at the grocery store, they behaved as though they were worried about something. The grocer, a tall, skinny Mr. Whalen, with his apples sticking out above his collar, his fish-belly, blue-white skin, and oversized fingernails, was the white man I saw most often. At least twice a week, I would accompany one or more of the adults in my family to his store. Looking through horn-rimmed glasses with what Grandma India called criminal eyes, Mr. Whalen sometimes greeted us cordially. There were even times when he inspired a nervous laugh from Mother and Daddy with his placating chatter. His store was one of my favorite places because going there was sometimes like going to a neighborhood party. Mostly our people shopped there, although a few whites from a nearby neighborhood came there too. There was sawdust on the floor, and the air was filled with the aroma of spices, fruits, onions, nuts, and potatoes. Maybe it was the festive colors and sounds that reminded me of a party. Early one Friday evening, when the store was crowded, our entire family went in for a shopping spree. We had Mama's teaching check. Daddy's railroad check, and the money Grandma India had earned from her work as a maid. It was one of those times when we all felt joy and peace and lots of hope. I looked forward to the bill paying because the grocer sometimes rewarded Conrad and me with sugar daddy suckers after the grown-ups had handed over the money. Grandma was the first to look over Mr. Whalen's bill. Her forehead wrinkled. She mumbled and handed it to Daddy. He looked it over and talked to her with his eyes. By the time Mother examined the bill, all their faces were grim. They quickly moved Conrad and me with them to the corner of the store. They were certain the bill overcharged them by $22. That was more than a day's pay, Daddy said. Still, they seemed frightened to speak up. After lots of whispered, angry words, they decided to complain. Although Grandma approached the grocer in a calm, respectful way, he shouted back at her in an angry voice, loud enough for everyone within a block to hear. He said he gave us credit when we didn't have eaten money, so he expected us to pay without complaining. Seeing Daddy's jaw tighten and his eyes narrow, Grandma touched his hand to stay him. There was an ominous silence in the store. Everybody was staring at us. Other people in the store, some of them our friends, stood absolutely still, fear in their eyes. At first, Mother, Grandma, and Daddy stood paralyzed. Then Mother took a deep breath, stepped forward, and said in a commanding voice, "Even when we're being overcharged? You just watch your mouth, or you all will be eating beans next month." The grocer was shaking his fist at Mother Lois. There was fire in Daddy's eyes, but once again, Grandma looked at him, and he backed down. The three of them cowered like children before a chastising parent. There was a long moment of complete silence. All at once, Grandma started to pull dollars out of her purse, and Daddy did the same. Together, they paid the full amount. Mama quickly shoved Conrad and me out the door. We'd make do with what was in our cupboards for the next few days, Daddy said. We wouldn't be going to that store any more. On the way home, Grandma fussed and fumed, saying she was fed up with buying day-old bread and slightly rotting meat for 1.5 prices of fresh food was sold to white folks. I couldn't stop wondering why Mama, Grandma, and Daddy couldn't talk back to that white man. Daddy was a tall man, over 6'4", with broad shoulders and big muscles in his arms. He could toss me in the air and catch me or hoist me over the fence with ease. Until that moment, I had thought he could take on the world if he had to protect me. But watching him kowtow to the grocer made me know it wasn't so. It frightened me and made me think a lot about how, if I got into trouble with white people, the folks around I counted on most of my life for protection couldn't help me at all. I was beginning to resign myself to the fact that white people were definitely in charge, and there was nothing we could do about it. The next day, Grandma called all her friends and tried to get them to agree to form a group to shop across town. All but one person warned her not to cause trouble. After she had dialed at least 10 numbers, she sank down into her chair with a sad face and placed the receiver in its cradle. She sat silent for a long while. Then she picked up her Bible and read aloud the verse that cleared away the tears in her eyes. "And Ethiopia shall stretch forth her wings." And a smile on her face and fire in her eyes, she said, "Be patient. Our people's turn will come. You'll see. Your lifetime will be different from mine. I might not live to see these changes, but you will. Oh, yes, my child, you will." But as time passed without significant changes in my life, I was becoming increasingly anxious, waiting for Ethiopia to stretch forth her wings. In my diary, I wrote, "What if Grandma is wrong? What if God can't fix things? What if the white people are always going to be in charge? God, now, please give me some sign you are there and you are going to do something to change my life. Please hurry."